this idea that was starting to fray at that time was this idea of honor, right? And what does honor, especially in war, look like? And he's trying to hold to
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, a podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. Today, we have back with us one of our favorite co-hosts, myself, Andrew Reeder. I'll be leading this one, and the actual host, Maverick, will be co-hosting, so enjoy that. Today, we're going to be reviewing the movie The Patriot. This is a 2000 American historical film written by Robert Rodat and directed by Roland Emmerich, starring Mel Gibson, Heath Ledger, and Jason Isaacs, just to name a few. Before we get into the actual story itself, though, starting with that opener, Maverick, what was your initial rating as well as thoughts about this film?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a classic when you come to the patriotic types of films. And if you're going into, the origins of America, this is definitely where they lean hard into that by showing you the colonial style situations dealing with the War for Independence or the American Revolution. And there's a lot of really fun things, if you want to dwell on that time period, that go along with this film. So in regards to that type of personality, I think it does fairly well, at least in regards to a patriotic side. If you want to have a very patriotic film, that's what this one does, and it does that very well. I will say it's a very brutal movie. It's not a film that I would encourage kids to watch just because of how gruesome it is. But if you're into the looking back with nostalgia, especially on the origins of America, it does that very well. And for my minor gripes with it, I think overall it's a pretty solid film, and I think my review reflects that. My total rating for it today is a 6.75.
Okay. Yeah. I really like this film. This is probably in my top 10 of all time in terms of my enjoyment of the film. I said when we were watching the film, if I had a nickel for every time Mel Gibson starred in a film where he was the main character and lost a family member, and that set him on the path of war against a tyrannical government, I'd have a lot of nickels. But this one especially, I think, just has a lot going for it in terms of the themes, in terms of the characters, even down to the side characters and the subplots that are going on and the themes that they're playing with, that are all of the different elements that go into play with the American Revolution. And especially this time, going back and watching it through the lens of reviewing it for the podcast, there were a lot of things that I picked up on that were almost subtle nods to historical implications during the time period. So I enjoyed it both as historical fiction, both the history and the fiction elements of it. It's not a one-for-one. They take lots of creative liberties, but definitely enjoyed the film. My review reflects that. I gave it an 8.1. It's not up there with Gladiator. It's not up there with The Prestige or Revenge of the Sith, but it's a really solid film. It's got a lot going for it. And I would recommend it to people. So that said, let's get into that quick overview. If you want to give the audience, Maverick, a quick synopsis or summation of the film The Patriot.
Yeah, so The Patriot is obviously a film about the American War for Independence. It follows the character of Benjamin Martin. He's a colonialist in the Carolinas who doesn't really want to join the war. And when his son joins after the Carolinas officially declare that they are joining the war, he feels conflicted about his son joining the war and urges him not to go. His son ends up joining, and the war slowly proceeds south until it comes to his front door, and he ends up trying to help both sides, trying to make sure everyone's getting the medical attention that they need. And in that process, one of the primary antagonists of the film, Tavington, shows up and decides that anyone who is helping the opposing side is their enemy, and decides to, one, burn the house of Benjamin Martin, and then two, in the process of taking his son captive, who was part of the war effort, also ends up shooting his younger son in the process, which then compels Benjamin Martin to join the war. This leads to him becoming a compelling part of the War for Independence as he pursues the goal of bringing freedom to this new country and also bringing about his vendetta specifically against Tavington. And that leads to the rest and the ending of the film.
Yeah, covers pretty much all the bases there. What were your thoughts on the opening scene of this film? Did it captivate your attention? Did it set up the plot well? Any gripes you had with it?
No, I mean, like, as I was reflecting on this film from the start, I was thinking about how it's one of those classic openers we get from especially the 90s and the 2000s, where it's very much introducing us to the characters in the world that we're in, right? It's not necessarily the flashiest opener that you see out there. It has a very simple opener showing the main character of Benjamin Martin creating a rocking chair, right? And he cannot seem to build a good rocking chair. And this is, he gets very pissed off at his handiwork as it succeeds to unsuccessfully hold him when he sits into it. And then from there, you see his kids, you see the news coming that they are going to make a vote on whether or not the Carolinas will join the war effort and rebel against the King of England. And I think that as an opener, it's all right. It's not my favorite. I think that this goes along the same lines of those earlier style of creating an opener for a film. You see that with things like the Dead Poets Society, where the opener is not necessarily gripping per se, but you see a lot of those inclinations of things that are going to become important later on. So I didn't have gripes with it per se, but it wasn't necessarily my favorite opener. I think my favorite openers go back to things like, I mean, Mission Impossible 3, as much as I don't know that that's the most amazing film, and we haven't reviewed that one yet on the podcast, but it has a fantastic opener with gripping you from the start. It doesn't necessarily hit that mark, but it's a solid opener.
Yeah. I think you kind of just took the words right out of my mouth, if you will. I as much as I enjoy the film, I don't know that the opener is one that necessarily grips me in the way that some other films do. Like the opener for Gladiator is one that comes to my mind, in that it just throws you right into the action. You are completely immersed in this world that is Maximus's world as the general of the Felix Legions. This one, I still appreciate it because it sets you in the world that is Benjamin Martin's character, in the world that he wants, what he strives for in life. And in the film, or the plot, when you're going for, or that they're going for with Benjamin Martin's character, which is to take everything he cares about, essentially. They need to push him to the edge. I think it does do a good job of setting up his arc, and that he's at a comfortable spot in life. He has what he wants. He's got his kids. He's got his plantation. He's happy with his life. And the war is almost seen as this inconvenience to him. But as it plays out, you realize it's not that he sees it as an inconvenience. It's almost like in his mind, if he ignores it, it won't become a problem for him. That said, I don't know that it necessarily was gripping. I think it does a good job of setting it up. But yeah, it was kind of middle of the road for me. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't phenomenal. So maybe a little bit higher than middle of the road. But yeah, it didn't lose points, but it also didn't gain, like, it wasn't like, oh, this is the best I've ever seen.
Sure.
That said, let's talk about that main character, though, Benjamin Martin. What were your thoughts on his introduction, his progression, as well as the conclusion of his arc, or how it terminated throughout the film?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Benjamin Martin's character is one that develops really well, especially from the start. And that's why the opener isn't as big of an issue for me, because it's setting that peaceful landscape for him, right? You get this character who really wants to be outside of the war, and he wants to protect his family, especially after the loss of his wife. And so the idea that he doesn't want this coming down and ruining anything that he's built at this point is understandable. And you get that when he goes to the vote down in I believe it's at Charleston. I'm not 100% sure on where that vote takes place, but when he's at the house and they're all having this vote, he is more or less saying, I don't want to risk other people's lives by voting for this. I'm going to, I can't do that out of some level of principle, is kind of what he's indicating. And they ask about his principle, and he says, I have a family. I don't have I don't have the luxury of principles, right? Which sets the tone for how he wants to address this issue. He feels like his number one priority is his family, and he cannot escape that. And when his son gets enraged by this, he goes, "How can you do this?" He feels that it is a requirement and an obligation of the family to be involved in this war. He decides to enlist anyways, despite his father's misgivings. And that sets the stage for him, as he sees that part of what he's trying to protect is something he can no longer protect as his son goes off to war. So I think especially in regards to Gabriel and Mel Gibson's character, Benjamin Martin, they are both intertwined very strongly in this film in regards to Benjamin Martin's motivations. I think that they started him off really well. I think that it takes a little bit for him to get involved, and that's intentional, because once he gets involved, he just goes berserk. And there's some indication that was somewhat his personality back when he was in the war, the French Indian War, I believe it was, that he was involved in previously. So you get this idea that he is this man who has chained himself down. He doesn't want to fight, but when he does fight, he just goes crazy and he just starts massacring the British army. And so it does well at taking a character, especially because when you think about, and especially coming off of a year of going over all of the Marvel movies, right? And you see all of these ridiculously overpowered characters. I think that you really have to find a way to temper them, right? And see how can you have a character that is very strong in regards to his prowess and ability, but also have something that pulls him back or her back, so that they're not just, oh, I am Superman, I can do whatever I want, and I'm also all caring and all loving, and I'm the good guy and everyone else is the bad guy, right? You have to have something that helps to create that internal conflict, and for him it's his family and it's his misgivings about this war. So yeah, I think that overall they do him pretty well in this film.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of the idea of making him overpowered, I think what's really interesting about this film is you don't really get the semblance that Benjamin Martin himself is all that much more capable in an all-out fight. But he utilizes his experience with the French the French and Indian War, which is just guerrilla warfare. And that's what he becomes notorious for in the character he's based off of, or the historical figure, which is Francis Marion, also known as Swamp Fox. And he doesn't actually really go toe-to-toe with too many people in this film, aside from that initial fight when he gets his sons to shoot from cover. And then he descends upon them towards the end when there's very few men left and they're all disoriented. And the only real fight he has where he goes toe-to-toe is with William Tavington, the colonel, at the very end. And even in that fight, he uses almost like a subversive tactic, and we can get to that later. But he's using his surroundings to his advantage. The thing that makes him so much more capable than everyone else is he doesn't fight with this idea in mind of you have to do so facing your enemy out in the open field. And that's something that the British have never experienced before, and that's why he's able to gain such an advantage. So yeah, I really like that element of his character. What did you think about the motivations as they shifted throughout the films, right? Because he initially starts out almost on this path of revenge for Thomas upon Tom. Well, initially it's, I don't want war. Then it's, he wants to save his son Gabriel and avenges the death of his son. Then it goes to, I want to protect Gabriel, so he joins the war effort. Then Gabriel dies, he gives up, and then he ends up rejoining the war effort. What are your thoughts revolving around his evolving motivations, I guess you could say?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and way to get into some of my minor gripes, I think, with the film, but I think that the arc overall is still pretty solid, everything being said. I'm going to say that right off the bat. And I think because a lot of it has to do with his family, that is a critical linchpin for him on what drives him throughout this film. And so, yes, like you said, Gabriel is a critical part of that, and him wanting to keep his son safe. And that's why even, from the beginning where he does enlist and his son's there, and they're there with what's the other, Colonel Harry Burwell, who's more or less his commander on the field. He joins up, and then he goes off to gain more recruits for the cause, right? And when he does that, he says, all right, Gabriel, let's go and start here, and let's go and find all of the people that we can recruit across these villages. And then his son goes, well, we'll be faster if we split up. You go this way, I go that way type scenario. And as much as he doesn't necessarily want to do that because he has that inclination, I need to protect my son, he understands it's the smartest thing to do. And so he acquiesces in that moment. But you see from that start that he has internal motivation surrounding his family. That's the core of what he's wanting to do, which is important because of what happens later. And there's a whole lot that happens in the middle in regards to the maneuverings they have to outgun the British and other type scenarios, to the point where Tavington is continually trying to get rid of this ghost, right? The swamp fox, get rid of this guy who is destroying their armies and subverting them. And in the end, he realizes he knows who this person is, and he goes off to find people who will then tell him where to find Benjamin Martin. And that's where you have the scene with Gabriel's new wife, Anne, I believe her name is, Anne Howard. Mm-hmm. And she and the rest of their entire village ends up getting burned inside a church, which is like a notorious scene for the film, where it's just utter brutality and the utter heartlessness of the colonel, where he just wants to see more or less the American colonies burn for the sake of creating the unification of them underneath the British Empire. So I think that because it's such a critical role for him, you see that Gabriel, of course, his new wife is dead. He's enraged and he goes off to fight Tavington. And in the process, he ends up dying. Right. And that is of the entire film, the bottom of the barrel for Benjamin, or Ben, as he realizes that the person he was trying to protect in the middle of this, he can no longer protect because now he's dead. And the thing he was trying to save ends up getting lost. And that's the moment where he goes, like, why am I fighting this? And at the end of the day, he decides to rejoin the cause when he sees the flag that his son had stitched up. I mean, I think that was the only part where you could look at it and kind of pass it over and say, oh, it's fine. It's symbolic because his son was the one who I guess stitched the flag back up, or is in his son's belongings, that his son believed in this, so he should too. I mean, my only gripe with that is that you don't really get an inclination that there's much of, if any, patriotism for the American colonies as their own nation at any point in the film previously. And so the idea that seeing this flag then reinvigorates him to join the cause is something that I'm like, I don't know that they necessarily built that up in a compelling way that I buy it to the full degree. But I mean, they were heavily leaning into the symbolism of the flag, and I think that they were trying to go for this goal that he is a patriot now, and so he's going to fight for this cause. So it's passable, but I don't know that I thought it was the most compelling of motives for him at that point in the film. But if you buy that, then yeah, it's fully compelling.
Yeah, a little pushback on my part. I think when it comes to Gabriel's whole motivation throughout the film, you get the semblance that he himself is a very patriotic individual. He truly and wholeheartedly believes in this cause. And you have this line that Mel Gibson's character, Benjamin Martin, tells his son, where I forget exactly what it is, but it's basically like, don't stay the course, I think is the line. And he says his wife used to tell it to him, and then Gabriel is the one telling it to him. After Gabriel dies, Harry Burwell, the other military leader, comes into the tent, and the last thing he says to him is, stay the course. In my mind, Benjamin Martin returning to the battlefield is less so about patriotism that he feels and more so about staying the course that his son has set before him. And that's why that line when he stabs Tavington in the throat, he tells him, he says, I guess we found out who the better men was. And he says, you're right. My sons were better men than me. And in his mind, it's almost like they idolize their father. By the end of the war, he's come to recognize that his sons were right, that he was, in a sense, hiding behind his family initially, and he was ignoring a war that was coming to their doorstep. And he wasn't being the responsible father that he needed to be in protecting them by being proactive about it. He was just sitting by and watching as things happen. Kind of like the saying, if good men stand by and do nothing, or evil only wins when good men stand by and do nothing. And he was one of those men standing by and doing nothing. And so he's being proactive in this battle, in that he's going to carry on what his son sons would have wanted him to do. He's being the man that his son saw in him. I don't know if you have any pushback to that.
And like I kind of see where you're coming from with that, especially in the light of him talking previously, right? What I mentioned earlier, where they're having that vote, and he says that, you know, I have a family, I don't have the luxury of principles, right? And there is some degree where he realizes, yes, that principles and family are actually intertwined. You are required as a father to make sure that you are holding to your principles, because that's how you actually protect your family, is more or less where they're going with that. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's some degree of that for sure. I think that there's more or less, there was maybe just, and why I said, like, if you buy it, then that's fine. I think there's a little bit of a lip there, if you will, or a gap between like the patriotism that they are symbolically showing throughout the film and like where he is aligned with that, and more or less the idea that he is so patriotic that he's going to fight for this country no matter what is somewhat tied to his family. And there's some maybe implicit idea that he's doing it because he still has family out there with like Susan, his youngest daughter, and his other various sons who are still alive, and daughters as well. That I think it's viable, right? It's passable. I just think that this is the kind of thing where I think one or two additional lines of dialogue could have jumped the gap for me there, where you see some acknowledgement from him that this country is important for the survival of his family, rather than just because his son believed in it, right? And so, especially because you get so much pushback earlier in the film that he's like, this is not he doesn't really believe this is a cause worth dying for, so he'd rather just not, right? So I guess I was looking a little bit more for like, let's see him fully embrace this to the degree that he's acknowledged that these mistakes have led him to this moment.
Yeah, I think this may just be where we have to disagree. I think the opening dialogue at the Charleston convention is pretty big for his character in terms of establishing that he does believe in the cause. But he tells the men at this meeting, I believe in this cause just as much as you guys, right? I believe that liberty is a worthy cause. But you are kidding yourselves if you think this will be fought on distant battlefields or open plains. This will be fought in our homes, on our lands, and the innocent will die along with those in battle. And that comes to pass, right? You see so many examples of that with his friend, with the pastor's congregation, with his own children, and
which honestly is like an appropriate perspective to have, because I mean, the idea that innocent people aren't getting killed at any time in war is just superfluous. Like, there's no way that that's not the case.
Yeah,
it's an imagination. And so the idea that he has a very grounded expectation of what's supposed to be expected in a war is in very many ways a contrast to his gung-ho son, where he thinks that this is a war that needs to be fought, and his son gets tempered in a little bit in the same way that his son realizes the brutalities of war when he comes back to the home, and his father realizes his obligations as a father and rises up to that occasion, if you will. So there is some level of balancing that happens in the middle of the film.
Yeah, and I think I don't know that I got the same implication you did throughout the film that he wasn't feeling very patriotic. I think he was fighting this war out of a less idealized form of patriotism, if that makes sense. He has a love for his country, but he has a love for his family first and foremost. And what he realizes after that initial interaction with Tavington and the loss of his son Thomas is that the British are a brutal force that has come to his home, and his family will not be safe so long as they're around, even if they abstain from this conflict. And so it's partially, he still obviously has this whole thing of revenge, right? You get that with him using his son's miniatures and melting them down into musket balls, and then him using his other son's flag as he rides into battle. But I think there's also an element to where he's trying to keep his family safe as his top priority. And I do agree. I think there could be a little more towards the very end. I think for myself, it was just like, I think there was enough there to justify him going back, between him realizing this is what his son would have wanted, the phrase like stay the course, which is again a phrase that he had said his wife had said, and then his son began to repeat to him. So I buy it just enough. You're also given the implication he doesn't really fight after that battle. Like, he goes home to his family and begins to rebuild. But then again, like, the Southern campaign is pretty much ended after Cornwallis's defeat. Anyways, I don't know if you have anything else to say on Martin's character, or Benjamin Martin's character, but if not, we can move on.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think that for all the characters in the film, he's very well developed, and that small gripe of mine is like the only linchpin, I would say, in regards to issues that I had with him. Other than, well, we can get to the fight with Tavington later, but like that other than those two things, like it's all good in my mind.
Sure. With Benjamin Martin out of the way, I think it's most apt to go into the antagonist of this film, Colonel Tavington, who he himself is also based off of a real character, probably the most historically accurate of the characters in this film. What are your thoughts on the antagonist in this film? Does he present a challenge for our protagonist? Is he a threat? Does he raise the stakes? Any gripes you have with this character?
Yes, in regards to villains, if you avoid we'll get to the discussion on that final fight once again later, so I'm going to bypass that for a second. For him as a villain, I mean, I'm not going to say he's not just the overarching bad guy, and you get that very strong I'm the bad guy persona from him. Other than that, I think of all of the I'm just the bad guy doing bad guy things characters that I've seen recently, he actually wasn't bad, right? He has a lot of really he has very small motivations that you see hinted at throughout the film about why he is the way he is, and more or less he has to prove himself, and he believes the best way to prove himself is the utilitarian means of screw honor, I'm here to get a job done, and the way to get the job done most efficiently is by killing civilians, so that's what I'm going to do, and killing people who have agreed to who have surrendered even to some degree, right? And I mean, based on the historical character of Tarleton, I believe his name was, the phrase back then of Tarleton's Quarter was something of the idea that this guy would kill people who had surrendered because he just thought they were in the way, right? So I think that in regards to the brutality of him as a villain, he definitely escalates the stakes. He's not someone to be messed with. I mean, from the start, when you first meet him, he kills the main character's son, right? And he's willing to do that without second thoughts. So he definitely shows a very real threat as he continues to chip away at the one foundation that our main character is concerned about, right? His family. And you see first he kills his second son. Then he tries to take out his family. They end up escaping, and then he kills his first son, Gabriel. And each of these things is critical for understanding the arc of the main character. So in regards to building a very compelling threat, he does decent. And I appreciated what he brought to the table. I think it was also important to have Cornwallis as a reflective point for him, because you're dealing with two different aspects of the war, and Cornwallis is his superior, and Cornwallis is more or less saying, you're reflecting bad on me because you're doing war the wrong way. There is an honorable way to do war, and you're not doing that. And he's basically like, I'm about results, and so I'm going to bring those to you. And at first he's shunned because of his methods, and then later on he makes a subtle deal with Cornwallis where it seems like he's going to be given Ohio why do you want Ohio? I'm not sure. Ohio's fine if you're in Cincinnati, but other than that, I don't know. So, if he does well in the war, he can have Ohio. And so when he makes that deal with him, he ends up going on a rampage to take out this great enemy of the British Army, which is Benjamin Martin. So, yeah, in regards to a villain, I think that he does pretty decent, especially with the backbone of this revenge that's going on between the two of them, starting off with Benjamin Martin saying he wants this guy dead because he's killed my family. And then you have Tarleton coming back at him, more or less seeing Benjamin Martin as the embodiment of him being able to prove himself. And so this comes to when they're having those peace talks, right, between Benjamin Martin and Cornwallis and no, I guess it's not Tarleton in the movie, it's Tavington, William Tavington, because they changed the names for him as well. Partially because I think Tarleton doesn't actually die in the war. And so if you wanted the bad guy to die at the end, you wouldn't be historically accurate to have Tarleton die there. So William Tavington, if you want him to die, is a new person. So anyways, with all that being said, this all leads to that when they have those peace talks and Tavington says, oh, we should just kill him now. And then Cornwallis is like, no, that's not the honorable way. We can't do that. And so he ends up leaving, and they have that little discussion where Martin promises to kill him, and they're going to see each other on the battlefield, which is what the end of the film drives toward. So, I mean, everything about these two characters becomes intertwined because of the motivations of the main character, and they do that fairly well.
Yeah. I don't know that they don't spend a ton of time on Tavington's background, if you will, and I don't think that they need to. His role in this film is to be the questionable military leader with his methods, and as the film progresses, you quickly realize he does not give a crap about how war is engaged in, as long as he comes out on top. And he even says this explicitly to Cornwallis when he says, I have won countless victories. Like, I haven't lost a single battle. He also
and to be clear, like, you can have villains who are not the most they can be very black and white in regards to it, and it can still be compelling. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Lord of the Rings films, and I think that that's a perfect example of that, where Sauron, you don't get a lot of backstory for him and who he is unless you're watching the Rings of Power, which that's a different discussion. But if you're talking about the films, right, Sauron is basically this big old bad guy who wants to take over the world, and that is his motivation. And the only thing that you get from him is his big old eye as he's looking around trying to find the ring so then he can achieve prominence over all of Middle-earth. And so the big scary bad guy is not necessarily a bad method to use. You just got to make sure you develop it in other ways, and they do decent at that with him. So, you know, there's no serious gripe, I guess I would say, with him in this one. I wouldn't say he's my favorite villain, is maybe where I'm going with this. He's good. He's solid. I understand the route they took with him, and I don't know that it needed to have more, but it's not like I felt like he was a standout villain, maybe, if that's what you're going for with this film. Yeah.
I don't have too many notes on the villain, aside from the fact that he functions as, in my mind, a really, really good way of driving Benjamin Martin's character forward by providing him that motivation in the actions that he takes. He essentially creates his own worst enemy throughout the film. And I think they give him just enough to make him a compelling villain, right? I think there's almost like a trend in recent film, and it's not necessarily a bad trend, but I think the trend is to kind of get us to want to empathize with the villains. And it's almost like there's a feeling of necessity to get us to do so. Like, they want us to feel for this villain and empathize with the actions they're taking. And they definitely don't do that with Tavington. Like, there's no point in the film where I think you want Tavington to succeed, or you feel like Tavington is in the right or is justified in the way that he feels. He is simply someone who you, as the audience, are empathizing with Benjamin Martin's character. You're like, we want this man dead. He has done unspeakable things. He's killed innocents. The only thing he cares about is victory. That said, unless you have any other notes on Tavington, we can move on to Gabriel's character, who I think is probably, in my mind, the most important side character throughout the film. Yeah. Any thoughts on him? Good, bad?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd hit on some of them earlier in regards to who he is as a character. He's definitely more of the gung-ho, idealistic son, right? Where he sees the atrocities of the British government and how they are oppressing the people of the American colonies, and he goes, that's not okay, we need to be our own nation. And he's definitely for the revolution. And so he provides that contrast because he is the son of Benjamin Martin and so intricately tied to the motivations of Benjamin Martin. It is a very strong, compelling force for the main character, which we talked about. But in regards to him specifically, his story arc is definitely one of the better ones, partially because it's dealing with this idea of loss, especially with the what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like when you have there's like the idea when someone dies when they're old versus when they die when they're young, and there's this idea of the fullness of life that you experience in that, where if an older person dies, it's still sad, but there's some sort of acceptance to that, where you understand that they have been able to experience life to the fullest, to go through their own arc, if you will, and to love, to live, to laugh, to loss, to all of those things in the midst of the struggle of life, right? And so when you see a young person die, there's almost some sort of extra sadness to that because they never got to experience life in the same way that other people do. And that's definitely the arc that you get for Gabriel, as he gets the inkling of some of those things, right? He just got married. He's part of this big important war to save the colonies from their oppressors, and then to die early on is in many ways like a huge loss for him and a huge loss for the main character, as you realize that there's something that was supposed to be beautiful is cut short. So I think that he's critical to the story, so he's great in a lot of ways. I don't know that you get inklings of understanding as he comes to realize some of the fullness of life in small ways, right? Where you see that he comes back a little more tempered once he goes off to war and he's wounded, and his father brings him back inside and helps to patch him up. And then later on, when he gets married, you see that he's getting these things that are critical for any person to experience in life. And so he's right at the cusp of becoming almost like his own man, if you will, right? He's accepting responsibilities in life. He is more matured. He has come to understand some of these things. And right when he's understanding those things, he dies. And that's where you get that loss. So I would say that, yeah, it's a great character. He's critical. I don't have any beefs with him.
Yeah, I think that Gabriel's character is done really, really well in this film. You get his whole arc of, it's almost the inverse of Benjamin's character, where he goes from much more idealistic, gung-ho to join this war and kind of becoming tempered, whereas Martin's character goes from wanting nothing to do with the war and kind of meets his son in the middle. And they do a really good job of having their back and forth, even from the outset of the film, where he says, someday when you have a family, maybe you'll understand. And he tells him to his face, when I have a family, I will not hide behind them. And as the film continues to, he even says, like, you told me once, because it takes over the course over several years. He says, you told me once when I had a family, I'd understand. I think I understand now. And he's kind of starting to empathize with his dad and forgive him for the way that his dad acted early on in the film, even to the end of the film, when he loses his wife, and like it's almost you get such a real reaction from someone who would be his own age, right? He's probably only 21, 22 at that point in the film, just got married, and he knows that when his dad lost his son, and he knows that when his dad was younger, what happened at that fort during the French and Indian War. And it's almost like in his mind, he's going to do what his dad did. He's going to go and avenge these people and come out on top. But he miscalculates because he's not as experienced as his dad. He's almost like a drama queen, right? In that scene, he's going to like slowly stab this guy, but he's dealing with a hardened tactician, right? Tavington is not just a British soldier. He is a well-trained, experienced, and ruthless colonel. So I think his own story is done really well, but he also plays into Benjamin's story really, really well too, and kind of helping him along that arc.
Yeah, and in some ways,
though,
he's also like the embodiment of everything that Benjamin Martin is afraid of, right? Because he does get the family that Benjamin Martin has in his own way, right? He has a wife and he has a future ahead of him potentially, right? And then the big fear of Benjamin Martin is that he will lose his family and everything that he loves will end up being lost to him. And not only does that happen in some ways for Benjamin Martin because he loses his son, but Gabriel loses everything. He loses his wife, he loses his life, he loses, his own family as well, and the result of him actually dying. And so this idea is like what Benjamin Martin is afraid of becomes a reality for Gabriel in every sense of the word.
Yeah. And he loses it before he even gets it, for the most part, right? He has a wife, but he doesn't have any kids yet, and it's just taken away from him. That said, would you like to go over tension? Because I feel like we've covered the main three characters, if you will: Gabriel, Benjamin, Tavington. How did you feel about how they increased tension, how they developed the plot throughout this film, and eventually terminated in the battle at the end?
Yeah, I mean, I this is one of those ones that I was trying to think back about when I watched it the first time, which is many years ago. So it's hard to do that, right? Because oftentimes that first experience is, I think, the truest experience of the story, right? How certain are you that things are going to come about? And I think because it's a historical film, there is some level of bleed into your understanding of it where you realize, okay, well, the Americans are going to win the war. Why? Because the United States of America exists right now. So newsflash, right? But then in regards to his specific arc, right? Because you understand that's going to happen, it was very critical that the emotional stakes of the film are not tied to that. They're tied to something else. And in this case, it's the family and the survival of the family. And so they do very well at casting that into doubt specifically. And they do that because people die, right? Like we said before, Thomas, the second son, dies, and then Gabriel dies, and Gabriel's wife Anne dies, and everyone else almost gets captured earlier on. So there's multiple instances where bad things are continuing to happen, which is really good at it, raising the stakes, right? Making us concerned, well, will they get out of this and survive and end up living happily ever after, if you want to use that phrase. But yes, they do very well at pushing that, and it's all because of how Tarleton is ruthless in his goal to eliminate his enemy.
Yeah. I think also the fact that they chose a military leader who is much less known to base the story off of really helps with keeping those stakes raised, right? You have Gibson starring in Braveheart. It's directed by him as well in 95, which is only 5 years prior, which there's like, as far as I know, barely anyone knew about like the Scottish War for Independence and William Wallace and all that leading up to that film's release. So you have a lot of stakes tied both to the War for Independence that's fought as well as his character. And to a lesser extent, I think they did a pretty good job with this one, even though like obviously the War for Independence is a super famous war. Not only are they tying the emotional stakes to his family, they're tying the story to a character who barely anybody knows at that point. And if they do, they're a history buff, and like they're probably going to have lots of qualms with the film anyways, because it's massively historically inaccurate to Francis Marion's character. So, and I think also the fact that they are willing to kill off his kid, Thomas, so early on in the film too, one, acts as a great way of just shoving his character into the plot, right? Like there is nothing graceful about his entrance into this war. And matter of fact, I think that scene where he is brutalizing the British soldier in that river is probably the most violent scene in the film, as well as a very emotionally shocking one for his son.
Right. Well, I thought that's important to note, because it's like that is another area where you get emotional stakes that don't necessarily need to be the death of someone who is close to him, right? Because his sons, they are emotionally scarred by that, and both of them have two very different, very concerning reactions. Where the older one goes, more or less, "That was awesome. That's what we should do all the time," and he goes, "Oh shoot," right? And then the other one is like, "I don't want to talk to you right now. What did I just see?" And,
Yeah.
there's a certain degree in which you don't want children to experience the brutality of war. And so them having to do that, and for the sake of saving his son, he feels between a rock and a hard place where he needs their help to end up taking out these 20 British infantry, right? But in the process, he ends up scarring his own children. So yeah, I mean, there's other things like that they put into the film that are very excellent at raising the stakes and the consequences for actions.
Yeah, and this may be an apt time to talk about it too, because I did appreciate the interplay between him and each of his kids. Obviously, they don't have him interact with all 7 of them to the same degree. Like, I think his one daughter and his youngest son basically get no screen time with interactions with their dad. But they do a really good job of his fear of losing his family. It's almost like he ends up, well, it's not almost like, he almost does lose his family, just in a different way than he envisioned himself losing them. In that you get Thomas, who is just so emotionally distant from his father because he is wanting to join this war effort, not for the same ideals of patriotism. It's almost like he's just a young kid. He sees everyone else going to war. He wants to take part. He starts to lose Gabriel, and the sense that he literally loses his son in the fact that he goes and joins the war effort, and he's gone for 2 years. He loses Thomas, and then Thomas dies, and then Thomas is gone. And then his other son, I believe it's Samuel, is the second oldest after his 2 other sons. It becomes very emotionally distant in that scene, following the brutalization of the British troops in that clearing. And then his youngest daughter too, which is a very emotional scene towards the end where she finally talks to him, but she's becoming distant as well, and he feels himself losing her, and that the war is taking her away from him. And so he doesn't lose all of his kids physically and that they're dead, but he begins to lose them emotionally. And so that does a really good job of raising the stakes as well, because he now has to grapple with, I'm fighting this war to protect them physically, but I'm losing them emotionally, and that they're so distant from me now. It's been years since I've seen some of them, and then I'm gone for these long extended periods of time. So I think there's just so many different portions of the film that work to raise stakes for him, both with his family, with his friends, and losing friends that he had. The one friend who commits suicide when he finds out his wife and son are dead. There's just all of these different things that play into it. So yeah, if you don't have any thoughts on that, we can move on. Themes, messages within this film. Thoughts? Did you think there was a theme that stuck out to you, multiple, and were they terminated well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the themes are decent, especially around the themes. I mean, there is a theme of patriotism, which is duh. I mean, look at the name of the film. That's what you got. So there's no surprise that that's a very prevalent part of that. I think of all of the themes, maybe that one's the one that I disliked the most, if only because it felt a little in your face in regards to how much it was there. Even though, I mean, in some ways they do explicitly state it, but even beyond that, it's just like, there is a flag in, 90% of the scenes there. This is America, right? Here's the flag, wave the flag. That's literally in so much of the film. So that's no surprise. I think that the other themes around like the price of ideals and the idea of protecting your family and the interplay of those was developed a lot better, especially in regards to the ideas surrounding Gabriel, which we talked about previously, and how there is the impetus of what does it mean to protect your family? What does it mean to hold to your ideals? And can you do that in the midst of a war? Especially when you have other people who are taking, successfully, it appears, successfully throwing out ideals for the sake of achieving a goal, right? You see that with Tavington, where he is the embodiment of throwing out ideals. And so the question is, can you do that and still not only be successful, but be compelling and on more or less to be on the right side of war? Are you doing the right things for this cause? And they come to the conclusion that those two things are intertwined, right? Family and ideals and fighting for war are things that you cannot separate without compromising yourself as an individual. So I think most of the film's ideas are developed well, and especially because it's grounded in the importance of family, they make it very understandable and palatable and applicable even to us to some degree, even if you're not fighting in war, right? The idea that you do need to stand by your family and stand by the people that you care about and also stand by your ideals. And those things are intertwined, and you shouldn't be compromising one for the sake of the other.
Yeah. I find it interesting because whenever I've watched this film, I've never really gotten the message of patriotism, aside from maybe the symbolism itself. I've gotten a lot of what you're talking about, and this time through, I think there was actually a lot about this theme of legitimacy, which, a bit of a side tangent here. I don't know, like, well, I guess I could ask you first, like, what is your context going into this in terms of the historical backing for it, aside from just the American Revolution? Like, it could be the Southern Campaign, the different ideals or clash of ideals when it came to the war for independence, the treatment of prisoners of war, etc.
I mean, yeah, in regards to the Southern Campaign, I recall reading one book about the Swamp Fox in the Southern Campaign, so I had some relevance for it. I knew about Tarleton and Tarleton's Quarter and how those things had gone down. I would say most history books generally will make a passing glance at like why things happen and then just go rote by rote about what actually occurred rather than talking about the motivations of why, right? And so that's where you get impressions or interpretations of that in film or in other mediums where they talk about, oh, what is the reason and the motivation behind these things? And whether or not this is incredibly historically accurate in regards to the characters, the question is does it portray the ideas that were being presented at the time well? I think that the ideas of especially family being a motivation for people to fight in the war is a very understandable one. There's the stereotypical one about taxation without representation, which isn't really touched on in this film to any degree. That's more of especially highlighted on the northern side of the war. So I think it's appropriate that it didn't come up in this one as much. But those are some of my initial thoughts. I'm not sure if you were driving toward something specific.
It was you touched on some of it, right? The idea that family is this massive motivator for a lot of these people, right? The men that are fighting in the militias are not the people that are wealthy or well off or are suffering massively from the taxation that's going on. These men also are living in the South. They're not living in the highly populated areas like Boston or just any like high urban concentration area within Massachusetts or New York. These people are on the outskirts, just like Benjamin Martin was. And so their families being threatened by the presence or the high concentration of British troops is what really drove them to join this conflict. And I think they touched on that really, really well. Another element that I think they touched on really well in an albeit subtle way, but they do it so well, I think, in just the little nods throughout the dialogue. And I know you're a big sucker for dialogue. I don't know if this film hit all of your points for dialogue. I really like the dialogue in this film. And I think one of the reasons I liked it is because of the idea that like less is more. And with the way that they're conveying certain ideas, they just give you just enough that you're able to grasp kind of the ideas they're talking about. And before I get into all of that, I guess I'll throw it to you. Like, what were your thoughts on the dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, I always say that dialogue isn't the make it or break it of a film until it is. So, you can have bad dialogue and still have a good story. And I think in this one, it's not bad. I mean, especially in regards to Benjamin Martin's character, a lot of his dialogue, it feels like it flows organically from the character we come to understand. And so any of the lines that he gives out or his son Gabriel gives out seems to feel pretty organic. Yeah, I don't know that I had any beefs in regards to that. I think some of the lines, especially around Cornwallis, were also especially very good because they highlight that distinction, not just of a worldview of how things ought to be, but also the things that he stands for in the way he discusses things, right? And this idea, especially this idea that was starting to fray at that time, was this idea of honor, right? And what does honor, especially in war, look like? And he's trying to hold to, I think in some ways it's good that it's changed, that we don't fight on fields and just like stand there pull out your gun, shoot, because that's just friggin' silly. But like the other ideas around that of fighting honorably and things like that is definitely something that they have to struggle with and figure out. And to some degree, I think that it's not as discussed around Benjamin Martin's character, but you get some inklings of that around what does honorable fighting mean, and he leans more toward the less maybe less traditional is more fair to say, because I don't know if it's not honorable, other than he lies to the to the British and says I have a bunch of prisoners and he doesn't. But you know, there's so I don't guess I'm rambling at this point. I don't know where I'm going with that, but yeah.
Yeah. I like the dialogue. I'm not as much of a like dialogue enthusiast, if you will. But I think one of the things that I appreciated about this film, we're talking about themes, messages, ideas that are going around in here. In terms of the historical accuracy of the film, Benjamin Martin and Tavington's character, they're loosely is a very generous term, based on the characters of Francis Marion and Bannister Tarleton. And like, it works for the plot. The thing that I think is so interesting about this film in terms of the ideas that are being exchanged and the ideas that are shifting throughout the American Revolution, the War for Independence, whatever you prefer, I guess, is the ideas revolving around the rules of engagement. And they handle it really well in a sense that I think is probably the most historically accurate that we get of all of the things in this film. First and foremost, you get from Cornwallis. He references the colonials as their own brothers in arms. They are viewed as the children of the British Empire, and the British Empire just thinks, oh, this is just a revolt. We're going to quell it. It's going to be over. We'll go back to trading with them. The American revolutionaries did not view it as such. You get the line with Gabriel when Benjamin Martin and the other militiamen are just killing the British troops after they surrender. And he says, we're better than this. We need to give them quarter. That was another really big point of contention during the War for Independence. And Washington even writes about it in his letters, is like, we need to be better than the British. This is a war of legitimacy. We are declaring ourselves an independent nation. We need to act like it. But the British didn't view them as such. And so you actually get a lot of brutality within the British military because they don't view them as legitimate POWs. They view them as treasonous and traitorous and ought to be dealt as such. And so the rules of engagement are something that is heavily contested throughout the War for Independence. And a lot of the British Army's brutality is what gets people to fight for the cause of independence. So I really liked the dialogue around the legitimacy argument that's going back and forth, right? What type of war is this? Which is why you have the two different names, actually. You have the war, the American Revolution, because that's what the British viewed it as. They just saw this as an uprising of rebellious citizens, whereas the colonialists saw this as a war for independence. We are fighting against a tyrannical regime, declaring ourselves independent. You also kind of get they touch on the slavery, and I appreciate that it doesn't overshadow the rest of the plot. You have this like very minor subplot with the character of I'm forgetting the black guy's name, and the guy that kind of is he's pretty racist towards the beginning of the film, and towards the end you kind of have them fighting side by side. It's kind of like a Gimli Legolas moment where he's like, I'm honored to fight by your side. But yeah, as far as themes, messages, I thought they were pretty good. I personally didn't get the patriotism element as much as it sounds like you got it, although it sounds like even if you got it, you didn't appreciate it anyways. So that said, how did you feel about the way that this film terminated? The way that the arcs resolved, everything came together, and it wrapped up?
Yeah, I mean, it's decent. I think that you get the ending that I think, especially back at that time, is what everyone was looking for, where you have some level of neat little bow coming around everything, where the bad guy dies, the good guy lives, they end up defeating their enemies and living happily ever after, with the building of the home back at the end. So, I mean, it's a little stereotypical, but it's not bad. In regards to the final fight, is maybe my last little beef with the whole film. And, you know, once again, maybe I'm nitpicking hairs here, but it did seem weird to me that the amount of times, because you have this little almost like mono fight that happens between Tavington and Benjamin Martin's character, where they're fighting and everyone else is kind of just ignoring them, which I thought was a little weird, that they just would let their other man-at-arms just do this fight and not help them out at all. But for the sake of the film, it happens. And then, of course, in the middle of the fight, you see that at first Tavington's trying to get the upper hand, right? He's getting little nicks and picks against Martin throughout the fight, to the degree that he ends up falling over and he looks like he's about to die, right? And, you know, first off, he just sits there for like 45 seconds and stares out into the sun. He's like, oh, shoot, I'm going to die. And then Tavington just sits there, does nothing, and then goes, more or less, haha, see, I'm the better man, prepare to die. And then, you know, has his little one-line monologue speech. And then he ends up getting the Uno reverse card played on him when Martin turns around and stabs him, right? So it's not the worst, but it did feel a little bit like this was played up a lot. So it didn't feel very realistic to me. But, you know, if you get over yourself on that, I'm sure it's just wonderful.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I appreciated the way they ended it, because we joked at the beginning about the symbolism of the little miniatures and how they're blue and red, like the redcoats and the revolutionaries. I think it's not like phenomenal foreshadowing or like recalling back to earlier moments in the film, but I think they do a decent job, especially for a 2000s film. Like I think they do a good job of not overplaying into like the dramatized elements. Like you get the fact that he starts melting down his son's miniatures and using them as bullets throughout the film, and you get lots of callbacks throughout it. And I think this fight is meant to serve as a callback to when Gabriel is killed by Tavington, where Tavington just lies there and waits for him to get close and then stabs him. And that's exactly what Benjamin Martin ends up doing, is he waits for him to get close and then he stabs him in the stomach. Do I think that do I think they overplay it? Definitely. I do. I will say there were several moments in the film where I started to realize they really like their slow-mo fights. Like they have so many slow motion shots where they're just like swinging the gun or the axe, or they're running in slow motion. And I was just like, wow, they just really like that drama of the slow motion effect.
Little Zack Snyder like, inspiration right there.
It was just like screaming 2000s film. But
yep.
That aside, I think the fight, like obviously they were building up to this fight between the two men. Mm-hmm. You get that when he tells him, before the war is over, I will kill you. Do I think it was the best possible way the fight could have played out? No, it's no duel between Obi-Wan and Anakin or whatever epic duel you can think of in your mind. But I think it's serviceable. It's not the highlight of the film for me. I think that the highlights of the film for me are probably the Charleston Convention is a big one. The burning of the church is a very thematic, or not thematic, but it's a very significant moment, especially when Gabriel shows up and realizes what happened. And like you get him kind of, he's almost like in denial at first too, when he's going through the house, like calling their names. The scene when his daughter finally talks to him again. But I think it, like I said, it's serviceable. I don't think it takes away from the film for me. And I mean, after that, you kind of have like the aftermath of the battle. Personally, I think the better part of the battle is when he's looking at Tavington out of the corner of his eye and he sees his men faltering, and then he picks up the flag and he runs back up the hill and he rallies his troops once more. I think that's probably much more thematically satisfactory, as well as just more realistic to how the battle would play out, right? You need it's a callback too to Cornwallis saying, like, if we shoot the officers, then what are men going to do but have chaos on the battlefield? Which, by the way, his conversation with Cornwallis is also just great. Their discussion behind the rules of engagement and what is honorable in war. But yeah, I think it ends in a serviceable way. You get the end is him writing that letter to Charlotte, which You have the letters serving as a way to kind of summarize events, which they do very well. And then the film ends, right, with them rebuilding his house. That said, what are your thoughts about the impact of this film going forward? Do you think it had a significant impact? Is this something that people are going to be talking about for generations to come?
I mean, I think that it's definitely, I mean, for one, it was successful at the time, even with the controversy about historical inaccuracies. I mean, it generated twice as much as it cost to produce. So it's definitely had something there that resonated with people. It was nominated for three Academy Awards. So it definitely was acknowledged to be a good film at the time. And there's something to that, right? I think if you, there's a lot of very patriotic, America type films that are out there, and a lot of them come in very, very many different forms, right? Whether you're talking about Saving Private Ryan, or you're talking about Black Hawk Down, or you're talking about The Sniper, any number of these films are talking about America doing America things, right? And this one is the same kind of feel of that, but set back in the time of the American Revolution. And I think when I think of films that are talking about the American Revolution, I think of this film, and I think that it does well at having that limelight in regards to people thinking about thinking of the American Revolution. They're probably going to think of a film like this.
Yeah, I mean, well, granted, my family didn't watch a ton of films aside from like Star Wars and animated films growing up, but this movie as well as Gladiator were two of the first films outside of like our kind of like little bubble that we watched that we were allowed to see. And so especially for myself growing up, like this was my reference for American War for Independence media, if you will. So I think it was great in 2000. I mean, the fact that this movie was made in the year 2000 and is still being watched and to some extent talked about today, like obviously this isn't Mel Gibson's greatest work in terms of notoriety. Braveheart's, I don't think it's ever going to be topped in terms of like his most famous film, and for good reason. But I think this film is definitely up there in terms of the movies he's played in. And like when you think of Mel Gibson, what movies are you going to think of him being in? Right. And I think it's well deserved too. Like obviously we gave it decently high ratings. You gave it a 6.7. I gave it an 8.1. I don't think it's as like amazing as some of the other films, but I think for my personal rating, I have nostalgia attached to this, but I also think it's a pretty good film. So, yeah. Any closing thoughts? Things you think ought to be mentioned?
No, I mean, I think if it's a film worth watching, right? I think we have reviewed a lot of those recently. If you've seen what's been coming out from the reviews, right? The Prestige is an excellent film. This is a solid film. There's a lot of good ones out there that if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth giving it a shot. And even if you think that not everything is portrayed accurately, there's still something to be said about the message that's there. And I think that this one definitely has that, right? So it's definitely, especially if you want to think about what war would be like back at that time, it's going to be brutal like this. So let's get a realistic view of that. You'll get that too. So yeah, it's very enjoyable.
Yeah. And I think what I would say to the historical accuracy of this is I love history. I enjoy this film. I think if you're such a stickler for historical inaccuracies, just view this film as a fiction. Don't tie the character of Francis Marion or Bannister Tarleton to the characters of Tavington or Benjamin Martin in this film. Just see them as historical or fictitious characters set in a war that is the American War for Independence. Because the war itself, the battles, the way they play out, very accurate. The world that it's set in, very accurate. The way that people had views of Black people, very accurate. Like it's a mixed bag, right? There were those who viewed them as friends and part of their family to the extent that Benjamin Martin does. And then there are those like the men in the militia who are like, oh, shoot, we're giving a Black man a gun. This is going to be a problem, and making fun of him. And then you get that with the brutality from the British troops, right? So it is a brutal movie. If you are squeamish, be warned. I think that there is still merit to watching it, though. It's definitely a good film. Not a family-friendly one. I'm not entirely sure why My siblings have all seen it. But it's one that my brothers love and will probably continue to watch well into their adult years, as have I. But yeah, that's the pod. Would you change your rating at all? I think I'd probably round mine out to an 8.0.
No, I mean, maybe slightly higher. I'd be probably willing to bump it up to like a 6.8 or a 6.9. But yeah, nothing really stuck out to me as being distinctive and changing what my thoughts are on it. I mean, it's still good. It's not, that's a very positive rating in my book. So it's no qualms there, but not necessarily anything distinctive about the conversation.
Yeah. Well, you heard it here, folks. That's the pod. We will be back next week with more episodes. And we'll see you all then.